This video covers the Greek and Roman philosophers of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Hypatia. My guess is you guys have probably heard of a few of the philosophers, and as we get into the next few slides, we'll learn a little bit more about each one. So the first philosopher we'll talk about is Socrates, and he's from Greece, and he's known kind of in the Western world as the father of philosophy. And what he did is he was really worried about ethics and morality within society as well as within the government. And he thought that human beings should be honorable, but it was actually very difficult for human beings to achieve that because maybe people were seeking fame or they were greedy and were seeking some fortune. So he thought that people should use integrity and focus on the meaning of life and one's life's goals, and to be introspective. He taught in the streets, and this was probably his downfall, and he told people, and he told young, youths, so younger generation, to use critical thinking skills and to look at the world around them. And if there were problems with the world around them, they probably shouldn't just follow along. Instead, they should think about it and maybe try and enact some change. This, of course, didn't go over extremely well with the government at the time, nor with individual family members, where the youths were challenging their fathers and their uncles and their brothers for some power in society. So he was actually convicted for corrupting the youths by discussing moral and ethical issues with them. As a result, he was actually forced to commit suicide, and he had to drink a potion of hemlock, and hemlock is a poison. And he knew that this was going to happen, so he had the ability to either maybe run from the trial or to face the trial and to drink hemlock. And he decided that the moral and ethical thing to do, based upon the way that he had taught the youths, as well as the way that he thought he would live his life and the way that he would show his integrity, was actually to commit suicide. So that's what he did, is he drank the hemlock and he died. Plato was a student of Socrates, and it's actually great that he was, because Socrates thought that you shouldn't write things down. He thought that that was a waste of time. But Plato actually thought that the ideas that Socrates had were very valid. So he took some of his conversations that he had remembered being a student with Socrates, and he wrote those down. And that's how we remember both of them. Now, initially, I think Plato was probably on board with Socrates' ideas, and he thought that they were very important. But he saw a lot of problems in society also with morality and with ethics. But he said, there has to be a perfect world out there where everybody would act with morality, and everybody would act with integrity, and everybody would act ethically. And if you studied philosophy enough, you could actually see this perfect world. So he came up with this idea that there were forms and ideas. So there was our world that we live in, and it's imperfect, and people make bad decisions, and people are greedy, and people don't always do the right thing. But there was a different world that you could see if you studied it enough, a world in the mind where everybody was acting how they should act. And this was his idea of forms and ideas. Now, he said that you could only see this world, and you could only really understand how everybody should act and see the perfection of it if you really were educated, if you were intellect, if you discussed these ideas with others. And that's where he came up with the idea that only the highly educated should be able to rule. And he came up with the idea of the philosopher kings. He thought most likely that because he was so smart and he could see this other world, he should be a king. What this actually translated to, so you fast forward another, maybe 600 years or so, and this is the idea of heaven and earth. So the earth is the world that we live in, where there's immorality. Even though we know that we should be moral, it's so hard to do. But the world of heaven is where everybody acts as they should. And the only people that can get there are the people that actually understood morality and integrity in their real lives. Aristotle was a student of Plato, And initially, he probably thought those ideas were good, and he thought the ideas of Socrates were good as well. But he eventually decided that, just studying one thing and thinking about either the vision of one's life and analyzing that, or ethics and morality, or forms and ideas, that wasn't enough. He actually thought that we should study a lot more things to be a well-rounded individual. And he wrote and he studied on a multitude of subjects, so everything from astronomy to literature to politics, and then also biology and ethics like Socrates or like Plato. And he became known as the master of those who know. He thought that we should use critical thinking skills and look at the data that we see in the world and then use that data to extrapolate more data. He's in some ways the beginnings of the scientific methods. Because of his ideas, and because his ideas are so broad, he influenced future scholars, so Christian scholars and Islamic scholars, and they actually went to great lengths to make his ideas compatible with their religions. And finally, the reason why you're taking this class most likely is because you're here for a general education class and you have to take, English and math and biology and chemistry, and then you have to take some histories and psychology, anthropology, sociology. All of those ideas come from Aristotle. He influenced the Western educational system, and that's why we have all of these different general education courses. So Hypatia is very unique, and she's unique for a few reasons. The first one is she's the only female philosopher. She's also living approximately, 700-800 years after the other philosophers, and she's living in the Roman Empire in the city called Alexandria, which is in the northeast corner of Egypt. And it was the most, opulent city in the Roman Empire at that time. It would be something equivalent to, say, New York City, or maybe Paris, France, or something along those lines, where you have a very diverse population. It attracts artists, it attracts writers, it attracts business owners, and it attracts people who want to learn. The Library of Alexandria was like a world-renowned library at the time that she was living there. And she was a philosopher. She learned mathematics from her father, and she became a mathematician as well as a philosopher. She was so well known that you could just write a letter that said the philosopher of Alexandria and it would get to her. She developed something called an astrolabe, which helped with ships navigation, and as a result it was so advanced it would be like a modern day computer if you're going back to the 415 CE, that she was really criticized because some people thought she must be a witch because a woman couldn't be smart enough to do that. Well, she was living at a dangerous time because you guys might remember Constantine the Great from the Roman Empire, and he was the first Roman emperor that converted to Christianity at about the 415 mark. So this is about 100 years after, and Constantine encouraged people to convert to Christianity. So she's living in this city, and there's a large population of Christians, there's a population of Jews, and there's also a large population of pagans, people who still believed in the Roman gods. And she kind of got into this political problem, and she was an advisor to the governor of Alexandria, who was a pagan. Well, the governor was in conflict with one of the Christian bishops at the time, and the Christian bishop wanted the governor to follow, maybe some Christianity. And the governor wasn't interested in that because he was a pagan. And Hypatia, by default, kind of became a scapegoat in some ways, but also she caused some problems for herself. Like, she did the same thing that Socrates did, and she taught in the streets, and she spread her ideas. And she thought that people should think for themselves and not maybe be so focused on religion. Instead, they should use their critical thinking skills. When it all came to a head in 415 CE, turns out that there was a Christian mob that called for her death and marched through the streets of Alexandria. And there are different stories about how this happened. And one story is that she was dragged out of her classroom at the University of Alexandria. And another one is that she was just in the streets. But anyway, the Christian mob ended up tearing her apart. And they used roof tiles, which were made out of oyster shells, which were very sharp. and they evidently pulled the skin from her body and then dismembered her body, and they burned the Alexandria Library to the ground. This is often referred to by historians as the end of reason, because after the example made of Hypatia, there were other philosophers and other politicians and people who were very, very bright and brilliant who were also writing, but they learned very quickly that maybe it was not a safe time any longer for them to populate their ideas.